In George Orwell's 1984, the two most famous men in the superstate of Oceania are undoubtedly Big Brother and his arch-rival Emmanuel Goldstein. Interestingly, however, there is considerable doubt as to whether either man actually exists. Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we shall ponder the existence of Emmanuel Goldstein based on what we know from the novel. Emmanuel Goldstein, of course, is introduced to the reader in the very first chapter of the story. He is always the principal villain depicted on screen in the daily 2 Minutes Hate, though the theme varies from day to day. Goldstein, according to party history, had been an early leader of the party and almost on a level with Big Brother himself. If we indulge in the party history for a moment, then the approximate date of his disaffection and exile was sometime in the early 1960s. By the middle of that decade, the party had seized power and was in a period of great purges that eventually left Big Brother as the undisputed leader of the party by about 1970. Other leaders and influencers had certainly existed at this time. Winston himself recalls the last three of them, Jones, Aronson and Rutherford, who are covered in their own dedicated video on this channel. Rutherford had been a cartoonist and caricaturist for the party, and even after his own denouncement, arrest and curing in the Ministry of Love, his cartoons still occasionally appeared in the Times. By the time of the fall of these three men around 1965, Goldstein had also fled and was in hiding somewhere. An interesting, if admittedly weak link between these characters is the Chestnut Tree Cafe. The cafe has a dark aura to it in the novel, both as a haunt of broken individuals released by the Thought Police, but also as a former magnet of dissidents and, it is even said, of Goldstein himself. The link may be innocent enough, though it's tempting to see it as a deliberate connection of these men. We know that Jones, Aronson and Rutherford certainly existed and were the last prominent rivals to Big Brother, since we also have Winston's very real recollection of them broken in the cafe, and the shady knowledge Goldstein too sometimes patronised the place. We do have a sliver of connection to a real man. On another point, in contrast to Big Brother, who is nameless and hence arguably even more mysterious than his arch-enemy, Goldstein does have a definite name. Of course, out of universe, the name is almost certainly specifically chosen, given the character is based on Lev Bronstein, better known to history buffs as Leon Trotsky. Trotsky has undeniable parallels, at least, with Orwell's big baddie in the novel, having himself been a prominent leader of the Bolsheviks in the earlier years of the October Revolution and Soviet Union. Trotsky led the Red Army during the Civil War, and was supposedly primed to take over from Vladimir Lenin as the leader of the Soviet Union when the latter died, only for the Big Brother-like Joseph Stalin to take the reins instead. Trotsky too wrote a book, The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936, and moved about in exile before settling in Mexico. Unlike Goldstein in 1984, however, Trotsky did not escape the party and was assassinated via ice pick, dying on 21st of August 1940. This seems to be an interpretation heavily favoured in adaptations of the novel too, the Radford film of 1984 for example, depicting the lean Jewish face of Goldstein with the goatee beard described, which of course resembles Bronstein of our world. The point here, in universe, is the specificity of his name. Of course, even if Goldstein were a completely fabricated character within the party history, he would still need a name, or title at least, like Big Brother. However, given we know of his connection to real-world Bronstein, and that he too was an individual maligned and despised by Stalin and other Bolshevik leaders, I think it's at least likely that Orwell intended him as a real individual, at least earlier on in the history of the world. I think we can infer Goldstein's story as likely true, given that we know about Ingsoc philosophy on power, funnily enough outlined in Goldstein's book, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. Though the book is eventually revealed by O'Brien as a fabrication of the Thought Police, partially written by himself. O'Brien, for what it's worth, does admit that the contents are true as description, even if its program for the ultimate destruction of the party is nonsense. In the book, it's explained that since the new ruling class, or high, knew exactly why they had seized power, that is, for the sake of that power, the high or inner party understood they must carefully structure society in such a way as to retain their power indefinitely. Part of their strategy for achieving this was realizing that such absolute power must be collective. Groups such as the Catholic Church, for example, that are adoptive and collective, can endure for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, whereas systems in which power is heavily concentrated into a handful of individuals will likely fall sooner to revolution, the wheel of history turning once again. This is just my opinion, of course, but I believe that, given this realization, the leaders of the inner party have always had a strict prohibition on any one of them becoming too powerful so as to eclipse their peers, and thus ultimately compromise the system itself. My theory thus follows that earlier on the leaders of the party came up with the persona of Big Brother, and that this character became the focus of love, adoration, and wisdom for the masses. I believe this based on two main reasons, all this connecting to the issue of Goldstein's existence. Firstly, Big Brother is nameless. This is important as it allows for an ambiguity whereby no one individual can claim to be Big Brother or wield absolute sole power. Inner party members we know of all have names: Withers, Jones, Aronson and Rutherford, Goldstein formerly, and, of course, O'Brien. For Big Brother to have a name would admit that one identifiable leader in particular held power above and beyond his peers. The system of collective absolute power would thus be compromised, and the absolute power of the inner party as a class put in danger. Secondly, the book, which is descriptively true, remember, freely admits that BB is simply the guise in which the party chooses to present itself. It all but admits the character is just that and no real man, given it states that no one has ever seen Big Brother and that he will never die. Ironically then, Big Brother is put forward as the embodiment of the party, the head of government and supreme leader, precisely because the largely anonymous leaders of the inner party want to prevent any one of them actually assuming such a position and destroying the very structure of society that maintains their collective power. Another interesting parallel of history in our own world could be the Roman Republic. The Republic endured for hundreds of years after the expulsion of their own king, based on a system of controlled collective power. The powers of the king were divided among magistracies. 2 consuls ruled Rome at any one time, and even then only for a year, with re-election to the post of any one individual only possible after a decade's interval. In addition, other offices such as the praetors, akin to senior judges, aediles, caestors, and such, also shared in smaller amounts of power. Overall, the senatorial class, the high or inner party of this historical context, all had ambitions to hold the highest offices, but also realised that no one of them could be allowed to rise to buck the rules and system that they had without risking the destruction of that very system that guaranteed the class as a whole a limited kind of power and influence. These Roman aristocrats were, of course, quite correct to be wary of one of their peers rising too mighty, as was demonstrated by figures like Gaius Marius, Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Julius Caesar, and Octavian. In our world, the latter 2 individuals brought down the Republic, ushering in the so-called Principate, where one man wielded absolute power over and beyond his senatorial former peers. Perhaps in Orwell's dystopian world, Goldstein, as well as men like Jones, Aronson and Rutherford, were seen as potential Caesars, threats to the system itself if they were not purged. Interestingly, even Winston seems to understand all this on some level. While at work, he had to rectify history to omit a certain Comrade Withers, a prominent inner party person who had run an organisation called FFCC, the group that had supplied cigarettes to the sailors of the floating fortresses. Winston was not sure why Withers had fallen from favour and his organisation was disbanded, but does offer suggestions. Quote, "Perhaps it was for corruption or incompetence. Perhaps Big Brother was merely getting rid of a too popular subordinate. Perhaps Withers or someone close to him had been suspected of heretical tendencies. Or perhaps, what was likeliest of all, the thing had simply happened because purges and vaporizations were a necessary part of the mechanics of government." Winston, at least, does imply here that such things do happen, that certain inner party members may rise to be a little too popular for the liking of their peers. This links to the final sentence of the extract, that such vaporizations are necessary to keeping the mechanics of government smooth. The rise of a Caesar-like individual would certainly cause problems in the long term. Translate such concerns to a figure like Goldstein. If a man like Withers, who, though an inner party member and head of FFCC, was relatively small fry, caused the party to remove him by perhaps becoming a bit too prominent for his own good, imagine how Goldstein's peers would have reacted to him. Another key characteristic we do know about Goldstein, and which we can take on face value, is that he was a compelling speaker. Winston notes that, although Goldstein's arguments were vacuous during the 2 minutes hate, they also seemed to him just persuasive enough to cause concern that others, less level-headed than oneself, could be taken in by them. Winston also describes Goldstein as, like some sinister enchanter, capable by the power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. This too is in the context of the man as being framed by the party through propaganda. Even if this is merely a warped negative depiction of Goldstein, it shows he must have been a dangerous individual, certainly capable of rivaling any other inner party member. Goldstein, based on these observations, was perhaps a very real individual and threat earlier on then, singled out and hated because he had been a threat to the party's own collective rise to absolute power. However, this is just theory on my part. Given all this, I think Goldstein's existence is far from clear-cut. It's a complicated question to answer, and a definite answer will be forever out of reach. However, we can indulge our imaginations, speak in probabilities, and ask specific related questions. Did Goldstein ever exist? I believe so. He may have been a Withers-like figure on a larger scale that either pressed for absolute power for himself or questioned those that did, and was thus outmaneuvered and driven from the collective for his trouble. This does not, of course, mean that Goldstein still exists by Winston's day. More likely from what we know, 2 Goldsteins exist or have existed. The real man may still be alive somewhere, powerless, perhaps at best heading a relatively small band of isolated dissidents, tentatively called the Brotherhood. More likely, the Goldstein persona was co-opted and created on the framework of this real man, his opposition and evils blown up to monstrous proportions to suitably contrast with Big Brother and provide a suitable target for hatred and anger. This as the mirror image to Big Brother, who is the focus of adoration and love. Whether the actual Goldstein exists somewhere or if he never existed at all, we can certainly all agree that the Goldstein persona is certainly a party tool used as a mechanism of control. This is not really even arguable. Of course, given the very nature of Winston's society as a world of lies, it can be hard to take anything the party says at face value. But if O'Brien is indeed truthful in his admittance that Goldstein's book is a fabrication, then this in itself is strong evidence that Goldstein is simply the face of the controlled opposition operated by the Thought Police. Unfortunately, the party and O'Brien's cruelty in mentally torturing Winston works against us here. When Winston asks if the Brotherhood, and by implication Goldstein, exists, O'Brien pointedly refuses to answer, leaving Winston and us forever considering whether the answer to this question is yes or no. So, what do you all think? Was Goldstein an ambitious and powerful inner party member who simply fell afoul of his peers? Did Goldstein ever exist in any form? Let us all know in the comments, and remember, Big Brother is watching you.